Okay, now that my cookie is dry, I am going to paint the face. I'm gonna focus on, try to bring this over here, the shadows that I see on the face, as well as some of the highlights, and then I'm gonna come into these darker lines and use that to finish up and create the dimension that we're looking for. This is sort of a cartoony drawing, so that makes it a little easier. And my go-to on the icing on here is ivory and white, and I use those same colors in my palette. When I'm doing shadows, I'll use some ivory and white in a darker tone of what's on my cookie. Then I'll come in. First I'll loosen that up with a little water to make it more kind of like ink, just a little less goopy, a little less thick. You don't want that on your cookie all thick. It won't work right. And I'll just kind of put this in some of these areas. Now this shadow gets dark under here, but I'll build up with the colors. So first I'm gonna work with this shade, and then I'll come in, and some parts my stuff isn't lining up, so I'll just fill that in with paint later instead. Not a big deal. You can make corrections with the colors. So this shadow comes all the way down under here and up between his ear and his face, and then kind of up along his cheek over here. So first I'm just kind of getting some color in where these areas are shaded or are darker than the mid-tone, half-tones. So this is a little darker. Let's put these shadows in. Some of these shadows will have some darker elements, and we'll come and build that up. We'll just start with this first. And then he's got a lot of shadow along his nose, along the bottom edge of his nose. And around his eyebrow. Around the back side of his smile line. So we're just going to build this up. Around the side of his face over here, and above his forehead over here. So now what I'll do is I'll rinse my brush, dampen it, and then I'll come in and sort of soften these up and sort of pull them out in the direction from the darker to lighter areas. So this gets from dark to light this direction. So I'm going to blend out to the right side here, just using my damp brush. Again, my just damp bristles, I'm going to pull this shadow up this way because it goes from darker to lighter this direction. If I block my projector, you can see what's happening. This one's not too far spread. And I'm gonna spread this one out just a little bit. So those will be some of my base shadows here. I'll kind of blend this one out just a little bit It does have a little bit of sharp edges, so I'm not going to do it too much. It's got a little bit of shading over here, but it's much more subtle. So I'm just constantly looking back at my photo and then just using my projector as a guide for placement because I can see his face on here. Okay, now I like to come in and do the eyes. So just coming into the white directly, I'm going to paint around his iris, just doing the white of the eye. Working super carefully. This is a really tiny space on here. Same thing on the other side. Just filling in the white of his eye with just white. The nice part is this is sort of a cartoony version, so I don't have to get too complex. Now, his eye is blue, but you don't see a ton of that. So I am going to reference my photo. I'm just coming here. The blue is only visible just on this side over here. And the rest is dark, but I'm gonna avoid the little shiny part of his eye. And if I mess it up, I can always go in with some white piping to fix it, to re-highlight it. So I'm gonna go around. Wow, I've got blue all over my hands. I'm gonna come around the edge. You don't want runny paint here. I'm dipping straight into my gels. These are really, really tiny. Okay, got his eyes in. And I'm just gonna work on adding some shadow to his upper eyelid here. It's got a dark, pretty dark shadow. If we look in here, and his eyes right here, gets pretty dark. Has a little orange and chocolate brown is what I'm using. Same thing on this side. I'm bringing in some darker tones up under his eyebrow. A little bit here. Also gets a little bit darker here, so I'm going to add more warmth into the depth of this shadow, just building up. And down at the very base of this, gonna give that a little more depth, shadow. This has a little more color. So I'm just going back and forth on my photo. This really curves around his eye. Some of this as well. Gonna rinse my brush. Soften up my edges of my shadows. If you're getting any water pooling, you have way too much water on your brush. It's practically dry for this. It's just enough to sort of come in here and move this around a little bit without spreading it everywhere. Again, fresh, damp brush. I'm gonna come in and lift some of that out to soften it. Damp brush, moving this around. This whole side of his face is shaded. This is gonna give it some depth. You can see this is where we're at so far. He also has a little bit darker of a shadow right along. Oop, I need to moisten my paint. Sometimes as you're working with it, it starts to kind of dry out. And just add a little bit of water to it. Deepen this shadow down here too. It gets pretty dark. Okay, so I'll try to get some of this blue gel off of my hands. Don't know how that happened. Wow, excellent. Oh well, I'm just gonna leave it. Just know I got blue food coloring when I went to add it to my palette. I'm gonna stay focused up on his eyebrows. They're kind of a golden brown with some chocolate. So I'm gonna take gold and chocolate. Some gold, hard to see there. Some chocolate, a little white. I had a nice warm dark brown there. Just gonna come in and paint his eyebrows. I can see it on my projector image. You might not be able to see it on the camera. Very subtle. I'm going to darken these up a little bit. I'm just going to add more just chocolate, straight chocolate into here. Darken this up just a little bit. Just sort of filling those in. I'm not going to get too dramatic with this. Then I'm going to come in with some espresso here. Just going to pull it up on the side, make a little spot, add the smallest touch of water to make it sort of inky. Add a little chocolate brown in there to keep it a little bit warmer. And I'm just going to add some of these like cartoony outline that are in the picture. The crease of his eye, the outline edge of his eye. Work super carefully on the spot. It's hard to undo. It's hard to undo when you get dark color where you don't want it. Crease of his eye here. A little bit around his eye. Just working carefully. Same thing under. Let's see. Right here, he's got a really dark shadow, so I'm just gonna throw that in there. And I'm going to add the really dark shadow under his nose here. And nostril. Super simple, not going to complicate it. I keep it nice and simple. Same thing over here. Just gonna deepen that with just a line with the espresso color. Okay. To do his mouth, I'm gonna use some pink, but pink is super bright all on its own. So I'll add a little chocolate brown to it to tone it down, and that is so much better. I know it's hard to see because I'm working in the dark with the projector. So I'm just going to work on carefully filling in his lips. Just gonna bring that all the way across. There. We'll come in and add the shadows down at the side of his lips. That makes it look more realistic. It has a little bit of pink at the bottom, but not much. It's mostly highlighted, so I'm just gonna put just a little bit here. I'll come in and blend that out. And a little bit here. Again, you can reference your picture to see where you want to place your colors. So now I'm gonna go ahead and add the white for his teeth and make sure my brush is totally clean. And I'm going to come in with my white. Ooh, moving my picture there. Now to keep this simple, I'm not going to worry about individual teeth. I'm just going to keep this really basic. Also going to put some white down here for the highlight of his bottom lip. It's highlighted there and up on the side down here on the bottom. little bit of highlighting there. So now I'll come in with my clean damp brush to sort of blend the pink down here in with the white to make this more subtle. Same thing over here. Just blend those in. Soften everything up. That's a little dark, so I'm just gonna come in with a little bit of white, just a little bit. Doesn't take a lot, and it's gonna lighten this whole thing up. Again, you're more referencing your picture as you work on this. All right, around the sides, using that pink that we made, I have to add a little water to loosen mine up again. Just gonna add, there's a little dark spot here in his tongue and here, up around here and down the side. And then I'll rinse my brush. I'm using a damp brush. Actually, it's like some highlight between here. So we're just going to take these two things and blend them together a little bit, leaving the edges dark to create that three-dimensional look with the shadow. Now the rest of this in here is just dark, so I'm gonna take my black gel, pull it up on the side, add just a little water so it's like ink, and I'm gonna carefully paint the opening of his mouth. You want to pull your brush bristles straight towards the brush handle to create nice clean lines. Nose comes down here. Carefully, work carefully. Just take your time. If your paint is too loose, you're gonna get spreading, so just work super careful. Okay, so now I have that in. I'm gonna go ahead and wash my brush. Look at my picture again, see if I need to add any shading or highlights, and I can see here there's a little more shading, so I'm gonna come in with that dark pink again, as well as over here, it's pretty dark. So I'm gonna come in with that dark pink. Just really carefully around there, and see that added a lot of depth. I'm gonna soften the line between the black and the pink with my almost dry brush and just sort of run between the two of them. I'm not really blending, just running my brush between the two colors together is gonna soften that up. Cleaning my brush, gonna soften up my line here as well, just by touching it with my damp brush. Okay, so now we have some shading on the side of his lips. Also, I'm gonna use just espresso for that. So coming in with the espresso gel, I'm gonna come up from the very bottom of his lip and pull, using my brush in that direction, pulling the shadow up to the side of his lip. Picking up just a little more color. Same thing over here. Kind of pull the shadow up on the side of his lip. And in this image that I am referencing, it sort of pulls a little shadow between his teeth and his lips. I am barely touching with this super fine brush. I don't want this to be dramatic or turn into a mess. So you're gonna need super fine brushes. Take your time, have a steady hand. There's a little bit of highlight on his upper lip. So I'm gonna take the smallest amount of white on my brush and just add that in there. And it's gonna lighten that up. It's very subtle. So you can see what's happening here so far. Okay. So everything is looking good. So I'm gonna come back in with my espresso and come into these really dark shadows, which are right here under his chin. And just come around and just reference my photo and use your projector as a guide. Just put this shadow in, comes down to his collar. It kind of comes to a little peak right here. And you can see that in your photo. And it's just really dark in here. And fill that in. And let's see. A little dark shadow right at the top of his ear, from the top down. So I'm going to just go like this. There's some separation between his ear and his face over here. Now here I have some icing that should have been hair, so I will just paint that in when I fill in the hair. For now, it's gonna keep. So now I'm just gonna come back in and refine any darker shadows. So using my espresso, coming in, thinning it out a little bit. This gets pretty dark under here, so I'm going to darken this up. And there's just a little line on the drawing, kind of enhances his lip right there. The shadow kind of comes up nice and fine, and this is definitely got a line coming this way. Now I'm going to rinse my brush again and coming in with my just barely, mostly, I'm going to just call it mostly dry bristles. I'm just going to kind of soften the edges of those shadows. I come up around here and sort of come down this way a little bit. Just move them around a little. It's coming together. It's looking good. So just stand back, look at the picture. I need to widen this a little bit right here. I'm gonna pull my line down here a little bit. between his tongue and his lip and under his bottom lip. Okay. Now, originally we'd created some darker skin tones to come in and add some shading. So I'm coming back in under here to really add some more. I'm just gonna loosen up some of that color that I already had for this. It's got just a little right there too. A little bit of shadow comes down here. It's got a little bit of color that comes across under here. So all these little shadows and highlights, as you build them up, just really start to build more of the picture. Soften that with my brush. Soften this up, soften this up, soften this up. Okay, you can see everything's sort of coming together here. And so now we're gonna come up to the hair. The hair already has a mid-tone because it's already this orange. It's sort of in between dark and light. So it's called a half tone. So we wanna add some shading and some highlighting. So we're gonna start with some shadows. I'm just gonna use chocolate brown because it's a nice warm color with just a little bit of white in there. And near his face is where a lot of the shadows come in. He's got curls, so I'm just gonna sort of flick some little round like little curved flicks with my brush to imply curls in his hair and make sure I get a nice dark outline next to his face. And then it gets nice and dark underneath, back here, under his ear. Darken up that line between his ear and his face. And you can just see it just starts to come together. These shadows and these highlights, it just really is what makes it stand out. So coming in next to his face, little C-shaped strokes of color for curl. Like this. Doesn't have to be neat. Not following anything specific in the picture, just implying that he's got this curly hair. So making these curls kind of curl up and away from his face. These curls on this side are going to curl sort of up and outward from a downward. So these go down and out. These ones can go up and out towards this side on this face, towards this side of his face over here. And then over here, same thing. Just creating some little C-shaped strokes. And you can come in and darken along his face, give some depth So see down here where I did not get the icing? I will make up for that with my paint. So I'm gonna come in here with my chocolate brown and just add that to his hair shadow that I have. And there's his ear. Let's get a nice shadow behind there. So focusing the shadowed curls towards the outside and the inside of the hair that's filled in here. And then I'll come in with some highlight strokes as well. So the shading sitting in around his face and then towards the outer edge gives the like it implies that the hair is sitting around his head, and it just gives it a lot of depth. You can also come in, which I'm gonna do here, with a little bit of espresso and sort of darken some of these up, especially the ones near his face. It's just a little darker than the chocolate, so it's going to add even more shadow to deepen that up. And now for some highlights, I'm actually just going to take the gold and white. You don't want to go in with straight white, it'll look weird. So using some gold and white and making sure it's lighter than the hair that's on here. It's going to come in. Oh, that is not light enough. So here's what I have. I don't know if you can see it. It's pretty pale. And it's mixed with just gold. I'm going to come in and just add same thing, little curly strokes. Probably less of these than you have of the dark ones, but it just adds to the dimension of the hair. I'm not watering this down a lot because sometimes the light colors are not as prominent. So I'm definitely not thinning this out a lot. Okay, so there's his hair, looking pretty good. And now his hat up here has like a little gold stripe. I'm just gonna mix that with a little more solid. I'm gonna paint that little stripe on his hat. Oop, that is not very noticeable. I think I'll actually pipe it in with my yellow. And I can let that sit. It's gonna be so thin. I can come back into that later and just add a little shadow to the right side. It's got like a little orange shadow, like his stockings. Ooh. Don't mind my messy hands, guys. Sometimes cookie painting, sometimes I accidentally get gels everywhere. And like blue, just for some reason, I had an incident. I don't know what's on his jacket. Okay, anyway. So that's it for that. Now we're gonna come in to the chocolate brown again with a little white. We're gonna really lighten that up. And I'm gonna use ivory to pull some of the orange out of that, so it's more of a light brown. You can see here. And I'm gonna lighten it up more because we're gonna add, if it's too orange, just keep adding a little more yellow from the ivory or gold. And so we're just gonna lighten that up. I'm gonna clean my brush off. I don't want this really goopy. We're just gonna kind of paint some little lines in the shadowy parts of the fur. Nothing crazy, just to imply that it's fur. So it's just gonna be little strokes and that it has some depth. So just following along from my photo, I'm just gonna kind of, there's a little shadow like here. I'm just gonna do some little lines. Sorry, I don't know why I'm talking so quietly. I'm concentrating. And it's got some more little lines on the collar over here. And then along the edge, there's a little more shadow, obviously, because it sits around the side. So just adding more lines. So I'm going to bring a dark shadow with black. I'm jumping around here, down the center of this here. And under the collar over here, this is just dark, fades into green. So just gonna leave that there for a minute. Just adding that shadow. You can see everything kind of starts to come together. Before we move on to the rest of the lower part, I just want to finish up the face with you guys, because I jump around when I'm just doing these on my own, but if I'm showing you, I should finish one section at a time. So his nose is going to have a little highlight, so I'm going to put just a little bit of white here, a little bit of white here. I'm looking at my picture and looking at the spots that are really white on his face, and those would be the highlighted areas. And again, these little highlighted and shadowed areas are what give depth and dimension to anything. He's got a highlight right here. And here on his eyebrow. A little bit right here under his eye. I'm going to add some on his cheek right here. And it's got a little highlight that comes along the side of his face over here. So I'm going to add that in there. Okay. They're really subtle. They're not too dramatic. I'm going to just soften them up with my almost dry brush, because I don't want them to look too harsh. So applying your color and then just kind of blending it out. I don't know if you can see all that, but now on his hands, I know hands are a weird thing, but I did decide to leave them in here. It doesn't have to be complicated. So let's try to walk through this. Using that color we had earlier that had the gold and the white and the chocolate brown for the darker skin tones in the face. We're gonna come down here, and all you have going on here So he has this finger here. If you reference the photo, curves around, and then his knuckle sits under here. Under this knuckle here. And this is his thumb sitting up here. You can see the lines. And his thumb is darker. So I'm going to just start adding in some separation with this color. Loosen it up with my water because it was dried out a little bit. And these don't have to be perfect. You're just going to imply that he's got clenched fists under here. I'm going to come under here. There's a highlight that comes down the side of the hand, so I definitely don't want to cover that up. There's a lot of shadow under here. So I'm just going to kind of bring this down here. And I'm going to come in and fill the green. My skin colored icing spread up there. So again, I'm going to have to compensate by painting it, which is not a big deal. I'll show you how I do that. This shadow sits all across the back of his hand. And it's going to have some darker parts. I'm just laying down the basic darker color along the back of his hand. Same thing on this side. His finger here curves around. That's his thumb sitting over there. It's not dramatically painted. There's a difference between that finger, highlighting it, or sorry, adding some shadow to give it some dimension, some shape. And here, this finger has a shadow that kind of sits weird. It's not just, you know, straight. And then a little shading at the top of that finger. And I can see a shadow that sits up here. Under the knuckle, under the knuckle, under this knuckle, and separation between those two hands right there. And I'm going to come in again with just this color and bring it down the whole back of his hand. Loosen up your color as you work if you need to, but again, this shouldn't look like watercolor, but also you don't want it all gloppy and goopy. Okay, filling this in. And it stops right there where his hand separates from the other one. So now this is what I have. Now I'm going to come in with chocolate brown, lightened up with just a touch of a lighter brown I mixed earlier. And he's got a little more depth right here. It's a wonky shape. I'm just repeating the shape that I see. Now he's got his finger has a dark line there. And another line that comes here. I'm not questioning the lines, I'm just painting what I see. Sometimes that's what you're doing when you're making a picture like this. Just focus on what you're seeing. And then this curves up and around with a thin line. Has a nice dark shadow between those fingers. It's kind of cartoony looking, so thankfully I think that keeps it a little more simple. This thumb up here gets pretty dark. And got a dark shadow that kind of curves under this knuckle. We can come in and blend this out in a minute, just kind of placing some of these shadows. And this one sits up and in there a little bit also. And then there's a shadow kind of like runs along the back of the hand, you know, like where the bones kind of sit and separate your fingers along the back side. And then he's got a little stuff's getting dry here to loosen it up. Sort of a little curve here where his wrist and hand start to separate a little, and then a little shadow kind of along that edge, and then down under the bottom there. It's also got a little shadow at the base of the hand right there. So now I've got this in here, block my thing. You can kind of see a hand. So now I'm going to come in with my damp bristles. I also missed a spot here that I'm seeing on my photo. It's got a little more color there. Cleaning my brush, coming in, blending a little of this out wherever it's necessary. Blending this on the thumb. Softening this up here. Blending the shadows on the back of the hand. Now the shadows on the hand, they just kind of are what they are and they sit where they are. So your projector is really handy for this. You know, you're gonna just sort of place what you see, and when you stand back, the eye will just recognize it as, oh, that's a hand. Because it might look weird as you're building it, like, I don't see a hand. And sometimes when you draw certain things, they look funny when you're building up the shadows and highlights. And there you go, hand. So, same thing on this side, taking my chocolate brown and coming in to the back of the knuckles again, where I see it's darker. And this sort of just comes down a little bit. It's not crazy. And then this is a pretty dark shadow right here between these two fingers. And this gets dark up in here. Gonna pull a shadow down in here. We're gonna come in with our black and really catch the edges of that, because in the photo that's just all nice and dark. So this shadow sits over here along this side, curves along the bottom of the back, kind of makes it look like it's sitting down inside of his sleeve. And then under this pinky over here, it's got a lot more shading that kind of goes down towards the point where the wrist is here. So I'm going to come in again with my Barely Damp brush and blend this out. You can see how that just softens up the transition. Softening the transitions. Again, not sopping wet. And let's also spread out some of these darker areas up here. Soften those up. Spread them out a little bit. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just gives the implication of two close fists with fingers. Okay, now I'm gonna come into my black and going to create some separation, coming in barely in between those fingers and these fingers with a super fine line. In between these hands, the whole shadow comes up. And along the edge of the, between the fur and the hand, there's a little shadow on this side. Just gonna bring it down super fine down there. Make it a little thicker right here where there's a little more shading. You can see how that starts to really build. I'm gonna curve the top of that pinky knuckle, bring it down just a little there. Gonna darken this. Just following the projector image, and told you, like, making up for the where the icing was, where it shouldn't have been, by painting over it. And this knuckle too, it's gonna sit. Gonna put a little line. I'm gonna put some little lines up into his fur to kind of give that a little more of a fuzzy edge. So what I'll do is use this brush. It has a nice point, and I pull and lift, and it leaves a little pointy edge. It's the same technique when you're using pencils to draw eyebrows or hair. You pull and lift, and it gives you a nice pointy edge. So there's just like a little line here on his knuckle, another little line here. A little separation with some darker shading between his thumb and his finger here. And it sits up and around like this. So there's a dark shadow. We come in here, working towards his coat now. This is a shadow on the coat, not the hand. And this shadow sits around his hand like this. It's gonna come up and around the edge, his finger, just using the black, and you can really see that start to pop. And so I'm gonna come in with just some black for now, and you can see my thing didn't line up perfectly, so I'm just gonna follow my white icing though and give this a shadow with my black. Gonna follow the edge of that fur coat. And a little bit of separation between his thumb and the collar with shadow. You can see that? So, for these larger areas, I do loosen up my paint just a touch. And this is gonna sit, there's a shadow all down here. And then it comes and starts building up here. So, just gonna build this shadow up with my inky black color. It's pretty thick there and curves up. Gets a little thinner around the collar, and I'm just telling you what I see on the photo as I go. So now, after I've placed that, I'm rinsing my brush, and I'm gonna just pull that out a little bit with some circular motion of my brush. Block my projector to see how that starts to kind of pull and fade out over there. That's good. Now, on the edge of that fur coat, just to give it some fringy, frilly look, I'm gonna take and pull short, quick strokes with my pointy end brush. You don't want them all facing the same direction because that would be unnatural. So just kind of randomly coming in super, super short strokes, and that makes it look like fur. And Up over here. I like that. I'm happy with that. I'll add a little bit here too. See, I just kind of am just going here. I don't really, just kind of look at the picture, and then the further along you get, the easier it is to kind of start seeing everything come together. I guess the main thing is to work lightly. You can always add color. Again, just repeating that because you can't emphasize that enough if you're brand new to cookie painting. My color's nice and loose, so I can pull it pretty far, separating his sleeve from the front of his jacket here. And it's got shading up here and along the side. Clean my brush, barely damp, soften that shadow by just pulling it out this way. See how it just creates, and the further you pull it out, the further the shadow will come. I'm not really pulling this very far out, so it's just enough to sort of create dimension for the sleeve. And I'm going to pull it out this way too. I usually flip my cookie around and try to work towards my hand, but in the interest of trying not to flip this around too much for the video, just going to work on it here like this. Okay, same here. So we can give his jacket a little texture by coming in with some, this is just gel green. I'm just gonna kind of speckle this over the top. It's leaf green, sorry. Not mixed with any white or anything. Rinse my brush so it's damp. And just sort of work that around a little bit. Make sure it blends up into the shading. You can do this, you don't have to do this. I just feel like it gives his coat a little texture, this fuzzy coat. Just gonna make this a little darker towards the shadow. I'm going to use a little bit larger brush for this just because it's a lot of territory to cover. So, got my leafy green. Spot it around, take my damp brush, and just sort of tap that around so it looks a little textured. See that? Yep. It's a little lighter off the camera. I'll probably brighten it up when I edit so that you can see it better. So we're just gonna come into the other side and do the exact same thing in reverse. Let's work on the collar and the shading of the stuff. So my color dried out. I need to re-wet it with some water. Going to add a little bit of strokes for the fur. You make them kind of squiggly. Out of paint. And, okay, coming into the black again and deepening up this line between these two fingers carefully over the top of that, down in there. And there's a shadow here between the collar and his hand. Shadow here and his thumb and his finger in the collar. Just going to outline that super carefully. And same thing, a lot of dark shading just all around the edge of the fur. Just gonna paint that in there with my loosened gel. It's sort of inky, not like watercolor. That around the side. Around the top, over the shoulder, and along the base of his collar. Just putting some lines. These are not as wide as the shadows over here, like the light's coming from this side. So now again, rinsing my brush. I'm actually gonna work with a bigger brush because this is such a wide area, so it'll give me more coverage faster. This is a #1 brush. I'm gonna pull that shadow in. Pulling this in. Rinsing, cleaning, so I don't just keep smudging color around. I just want to pull the color out that I am focusing on at the time. Cleaning my brush. Coming back in. Cleaning, blending. Try to blend that from here. Okay. It's a little dramatic, but that's okay. I can actually come in here and loosen that up just a little bit. Okay. Taking the leafy green, I'm just gonna dab a little bit of just straight leaf green onto his coat and then just work it around. Your bristles need to be a little damp for this. And if it stops moving, rinse your brush, get the excess water off, and then come back in and pick up where you left off. So, a little texture on his coat. I need to come in and add those little furry edges here with my little lines. So, I'm just gonna add some of those in. I'm gonna add a little, reference my photo and add some lines here. Okay, so that is dry now. So I'm gonna come back up to that, and just like on his pants, the shading on that little stripe is like orange. So I'm just gonna put some orange, clean my brush, and then pull it out a little bit. I'm gonna take some straight leaf green loosened up with water, and actually gonna need a little black there. This green's not quite deep enough. Just gonna add a shadow in this corner that kind of comes out above the stripe and at the top of his hat. I'm gonna stand up and look at this, see if I've missed anything. So when I look at the photo and I look at my cookie, I feel like the shading between his eyes is not coming together close enough. So I'm gonna work on that here. I'm gonna add a little more, bring it in further. Just refining anything that I'm kind of like, bring this down. So at this point, you're just gonna reference your photo and refine anything that you want to adjust. You're just gonna have to look back and forth between the photo and your cookie, see if there's anything else you wanna adjust. Yeah, I like that. See that it brought those a little closer together. I'm gonna add a little more, just a touch more shadow on his forehead too, up here. And then with my clean brush, blend it out. Gonna take my black and just very thinly outline between his hand and his little furry cuff. It's gonna get kind of, it's got some little fur texture in there down here. Just add that in a little bit. Kind of outline, make a shadow inside of his, it's like his arm inside of the little furry cuff there has a dark line, has a dark shadow. Why? What? I didn't know that. Okay. Bye. Shadow here. Anyway, okay. I'm gonna do the same thing down here. Just in a few spots along the edge. Just create some really short strokes. To imply fur, give a little texture. Doesn't have to be perfect. Also gonna create some little furry texture with the lighter brown just to soften it up a little bit. Some squiggly lines. Uh-oh. Okay. That's the end.